The Arizona sun of 1885 was a merciless god, and the land its altar. For months it had baked the plains into a cracked ochre canvas, where the only movement was the shimmering heat haze and the ceaseless worrying of a wind that carried more dust than relief. It was a wind that scoured the paint from barns, stole the moisture from a man's lips, and whispered of endings, not beginnings. This was the world of Elias Harper, and he was a man forged in its image, weathered, silent, and solitary. His ranch was a lonely outpost, a collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings crouched against the vast emptiness. 5 years had passed since the fire, 5 years since the smell of smoke and the screams of his wife. Sarah had seared themselves into his memory. He had built the new house himself, with thicker walls and fewer windows, less a home than a fortress against the past. His heart, too, had been rebuilt along similar lines. At 45, Elias moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who expects nothing from the day but the work it contains. His face was a landscape of its own, carved by sun and sorrow, with eyes the color of a faded sky that rarely met another's. He spoke only when necessary, a command to his horse, a price for his cattle, a curt nod to the mail carrier. The townsfolk in Prescott knew him as the widower from the outlying range, a man as hard and unforgiving as the territory he worked. They left him to his grief, and he was grateful for it. Grief was a familiar companion. It asked for nothing but his silence. It was on a trip back from the lumber mill, the wagon heavy with pine that smelled of a life far from this arid expanse, that his solitude was broken. The trail ahead was disturbed, not by cattle or a stray coyote, but by the sharp, violent geometry of chaos. A buckboard wagon lay on its side like a slaughtered beast, one wheel still spinning in a lazy, mocking circle. The 2 horses that had pulled it were a tangle of leather and lifeless flesh, their bodies riddled with the brutal efficiency of a bandit raid. It was a common enough sight, a grim tableau of the West's casual cruelty. Elias reined in his team, his hand resting on the stock of the Winchester that lay across his lap. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the glare. Nothing. The vultures had not yet begun their patient vigil, meaning the attack was recent. The perpetrators were likely long gone, pockets heavier with whatever poor souls had been traveling this road. He felt a familiar emptiness, a dull resignation. This land took what it wanted. Duty, a hollowed-out remnant of the man he once was, compelled him to dismount. He walked toward the wreckage, his boots crunching on the parched ground. A woman's bonnet lay in the dust, its faded blue ribbon stirred by the hot wind. A spilled crate of tinned goods, a man's coat with a dark stain blooming on the chest. He found the driver a few yards away, face down in the dirt, his life story ended by a bullet to the back. Elias felt no shock, only a profound weariness. He was about to turn back, to leave this scene to the sun and the scavengers, when a flicker of movement caught his eye near the base of a gnarled mesquite tree. It was a patch of calico, the color of cornflowers, nearly lost against the brown earth. He approached cautiously, his rifle held ready. It was a woman. She was curled on her side, her dress torn at the shoulder, her dark hair matted with dust and blood from a gash on her temple. But it was her hands that held his gaze. They were bound tightly in front of her with a length of rough hemp rope, the skin beneath already rubbed raw and bleeding. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged, a faint, feverish heat radiating from her skin even in the oppressive warmth of the afternoon. Elias knelt, his joints protesting. For a long moment, he did nothing. This was not his concern. She was trouble, a complication in a life he had meticulously stripped of all complications. Leaving her here was a death sentence, but taking her was an invitation to a world he had long since bolted the door on. He saw the raw, chafed flesh of her wrists, and felt an unwelcome stir of something other than apathy. It was the ghost of compassion, faint and troublesome. With a curse that was lost to the wind, he drew his knife and sliced through the rope. Her hands fell limply to her sides. He noted the thinness of her frame, the sharp angle of her cheekbones, the faint, purpled bruise blooming along her jawline. This was a woman well acquainted with hardship, even before the bandits had found her. He gently brushed the hair from her face. She moaned softly, a sound of pure misery that pricked at the calloused shell around his heart. He made his decision with a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his resistance. He couldn't leave her. He couldn't. He fetched the water canteen from his wagon and carefully moistened her cracked lips. Then, with a grunt of effort, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as fragile as a wounded bird. He carried her to his wagon, laying her as gently as his stiff, unpracticed hands would allow on a bed of old blankets in the back, before continuing the slow journey home. The woman, whose name was Miriam, drifted in and out of a fevered haze for the next 2 days. Elias tended to her with a detached efficiency. He cleaned and dressed the gash on her temple, forced sips of water and thin broth between her lips, and sat through the long, hot nights, listening to her delirious murmurs, fragmented pleas and cries that spoke of a terror that went beyond the roadside attack. He was a rancher, accustomed to mending livestock, and he treated her with the same impersonal care. He told himself it was a temporary duty, a brief penance for some unnamed sin. As soon as she was well, she would be on her way. On the morning of the 3rd day, she awoke with clear eyes. Fear was the first thing in them, sharp and wild. She pushed herself up, her gaze darting around the sparse, unfamiliar room, the simple wooden bed frame, the stone hearth, the single window looking out onto an endless expanse of brown. When she saw him standing in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the morning light, she flinched and pulled the rough blanket up to her chin. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "My ranch," Elias said, his tone flat. He did not step closer. "You're in a bad way. Bandits got your wagon." Her eyes filled with a fresh wave of horror as memory returned. She touched her temple, then looked at her own hands, free and resting on the blanket. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. You saved me." "I brought you here," he corrected, unwilling to accept the title of savior. "You can stay a few days, till you're on your feet." He let the unspoken words hang in the air between them, asterisk, and then you will leave asterisk. He made it a point not to look at her directly, focusing instead on a crack in the wooden floor. "Don't expect anything from me." She nodded, a small, jerky movement. She seemed to shrink into herself, understanding the terms of her rescue perfectly. She was a burden, a temporary charity, but beneath the fear, a flicker of profound gratitude shone in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, the words barely audible. "Whatever you ask, thank you." He gave a curt nod and left, closing the door behind him, feeling the familiar comfort of being alone again. Their life together began in a state of strained, silent coexistence. Miriam was weak, but she possessed a quiet resilience. She would move about the small house, her steps tentative, always careful to stay out of his way. They ate their meals in silence at the rough-hewn table, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin plates and the relentless sigh of the wind outside. For Elias, the presence of another person in Sarah's kitchen was a constant, low-grade irritant. The house felt smaller, his solitude compromised. A week after her arrival, the mail carrier, Silas Croft, made his monthly ride out to the ranch. He was a garrulous, weedy man whose primary trade was gossip. His eyes widened when he saw Miriam standing in the doorway, a fleeting shadow before she retreated back into the house. "Well now, Elias," Silas said, a knowing grin spreading across his face. "Didn't take you for the kind to be ordering a bride through the catalogs." Elias's face darkened. "She's not a bride. Had some trouble on the road?" Silas's eyes glinted with interest. "Trouble, you say? Like that one over in Flagstaff? the one that run off from her husband after a week. Town's got no patience for a woman who won't honor her bargain. They say she was no better than she ought to be, taking a man's money and then leaving him high and dry. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. A runaway woman is just a polite name for trouble. Elias's hand tightened on the mailbag. He could feel Miriam's presence just inside the door, could almost feel her shame and fear radiating through the wood. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that Silas had hit close to the mark. The tied hands, the bruises, the terror in her sleep. It all pointed to a story of a woman fleeing a man, not just a random act of violence. "Give me my mail, Silas," Elias said, his voice low and cold. "And keep your gossip for the saloon." The mail carrier, chastened by the rancher's icy tone, handed over the letters and quickly rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and unspoken judgment in his wake. Elias stood for a long time, staring out at the empty trail. The woman inside was not just a stranger. She was a pariah, a piece of trouble that had washed up at his door, and he, against his better judgment, had let her in. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the silent accord of two people living on the edge of each other's solitude. Miriam, it turned out, was a woman woven from quiet competence. Elias, a man who valued work above all else, could not help but notice. He saw it in the way she moved around the small kitchen, her motions economical and sure. The first time she had cooked a real meal, he had stood in the doorway, watching with a guarded curiosity. She had found a half-empty sack of flour and a tin of lard, and from these meager provisions, she produced biscuits so light they seemed to defy the gravity of their harsh world, served alongside a gravy made from salt pork and grit. The smell, warm, savory, undeniably home-like, was the first ghost to cross his threshold. It was Sarah's smell, the scent of a life he had buried. He ate in his usual silence, but the food was a revelation. For 5 years, he had subsisted on hardtack, canned beans, and whatever meat he could cook over a fire until it was black. This was nourishment. It felt like a betrayal. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Miriam began to reclaim the house from the dust and neglect that were the physical manifestations of Elias's grief. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing the soot from the stove until the iron gleamed. She washed the grimy windows, letting in a clarity of light the house had not seen in years. One afternoon, he came in from the corral to find her mending one of his shirts, her needle moving with a swift, practiced rhythm. The sight sent a strange, uncomfortable jolt through him. It was an act of intimacy, of care, that he had not asked for and did not know how to receive. These skills, he knew, were not learned in a comfortable home. They were the hard-won lessons of a life of making do. He saw it in the way she could gentle a nervous horse with a low murmur and a steady hand, a trick that took most men years to master. He saw it in the way she could make a threadbare piece of cloth last another season. These were the talents of the poor and the resilient, and they hinted at the past she never spoke of, a life lived under the thumb of a man who provided little and demanded everything. His initial indifference began to curdle into a state of chronic unease. Her presence was a quiet but constant force, a steady, low hum in the profound silence of his life. The emptiness of the chair across from him at the supper table, once a monument to his loss, was now occupied. He found himself acutely aware of her, the soft sound of her breathing, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. He felt clumsy, oafish, a bull in a world that suddenly contained a fragile, foreign object. He had forgotten how to share a space, how to exist in proximity to another's soul. One afternoon, Miriam finally breached the topic he had been avoiding. She caught him by the woodshed, her expression earnest and her hands twisting in the fabric of her worn dress. "Mr. Harper," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I am well now, strong enough to travel. I must not impose on your kindness any longer. If you could just point me toward the next town." Elias busied himself with a length of rope, his eyes fixed on a knot he was testing. The desert air was thick with the promise of a coming storm. The sky to the west a bruised, turbulent purple. "Bad weather moving in?" he grunted, not looking at her. "No sense in starting a journey just to get caught in it. Another day or two won't matter." It was a dismissal, not an invitation, but it was enough. Miriam nodded, a flicker of something, disappointment, relief, in her eyes before she turned and went back inside. He had bought himself more time, but he could not have said why. That night, the storm broke. It came not as a gentle shower, but as a biblical deluge, a violent unburdening of the heavens. Rain hammered against the roof in a deafening, relentless torrent. Wind howled through the eaves, and the world outside the windows dissolved into a churning darkness streaked with blinding flashes of lightning. They were trapped, sealed inside the small cabin, the storm rendering the vast Arizona landscape into a single, claustrophobic room. A chill seeped through the walls, and Elias built up the fire in the hearth. The flames cast long, dancing shadows, creating an island of warmth and light in the heart of the tempest. Miriam brought a chair closer to the fire, a small sewing basket in her lap. Elias settled in his own chair on the other side of the hearth, pulling a box of worn leather and tools toward him. He began to work on a frayed rein, his powerful hands moving with surprising dexterity as he spliced and oiled the leather. For an hour, they sat in a silence broken only by the roar of the storm and the crackle of the fire. It was a different kind of silence than before, not the tense, awkward quiet of their meals, but something deeper, more contemplative, as if the storm had stripped away the need for pretense. He worked on his leather. She worked on her mending. Two solitary people engaged in the simple, ancient acts of repair. Miriam paused, her needle still. She was staring into the flames, her face etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed to steal the very air from the room. Elias found himself watching her, a strange tightening in his chest. "My husband," she began, her voice so low it was nearly swallowed by a peal of thunder. "The man I was sent to, he was not a kind man. He drank. The only time he was quiet was when he was asleep or when he was gone." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "We had a son, a little boy. I named him Samuel." Elias stopped his work, his hands frozen around the leather rein. He did not want to hear this. He did not want to know her sorrows. His own were a heavy enough burden. "He was born too early," she continued, her gaze still fixed on the fire. "He was so small, so terribly small. He lived for 2 days. He never cried, just made a little sound, like a kitten. I held him the whole time. The doctor said there was nothing to be done. My husband, he was angry. He said it was a waste of a good field hand." Her voice broke on a sob she tried to swallow. "When Samuel died, I wrapped him in the only fine thing I had, a piece of linen my mother had given me. I wanted to bury him on the hill, where the morning sun would touch his grave. But my husband, he said the ground was too hard. He buried him behind the smokehouse. He didn't even make a proper cross." She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. She wasn't looking at Elias, but through him, back into the heart of a memory that would never leave her. "I would go out there at night when he was asleep, and I would talk to my baby. I told him about the sun and the sky and what it felt like to be warm. I promised him I would never, ever forget him." She drew her arms around herself, rocking slightly. "That is a promise a mother keeps." The story fell into the quiet of the room, each word a perfectly polished stone of grief. Elias felt something inside him crack. He, who had built a fortress of silence and solitude around the memory of his wife, was suddenly defenseless against the simple, devastating truth of this woman's loss. He saw the fire, smelled the smoke, heard Sarah's final cry. He felt the agony of his own powerlessness, the crushing weight of a future that had burned to ashes in a single night. He thought he had forgotten how to cry. He believed his grief was a hard, dry thing, a permanent drought of the soul. But as he sat there, listening to the rain and the quiet testimony of Miriam's broken heart, he felt a hot, stinging pressure build behind his eyes. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. Then another. A ragged, choked sound escaped his throat, a sound of such profound anguish that it startled them both. He was not crying for her baby. He was not crying for her. He was crying for everything. For Sarah. For the children they would never have. For the 5 years he had spent embalming his heart in bitterness. For the fragile, broken woman across from him who had just handed him a piece of her soul. Miriam looked at him, her own grief momentarily forgotten in the face of his. She saw not the cold, hard rancher, but a man drowning in a sorrow as deep as her own. She said nothing. She did not move to comfort him. She simply sat with him in the flickering firelight, two shipwrecked souls clinging to the same piece of wreckage in a storm. And for the first time, they were not alone. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. A fragile thread of empathy spun in the heart of the tempest. The rain eventually ceased, but the land, unwilling to grant any true reprieve, simply traded one form of hostility for another. The sky, washed clean and blue for a few brief days, turned a hazy, malevolent yellow. The wind returned, no longer carrying the promise of moisture, but the stinging grit of the desert itself. Dust storms, great rolling walls of earth and sky, became a daily occurrence, swallowing the horizon and reducing the world to a suffocating, sand-blasted twilight that could last for hours. Miriam was fully healed. Her strength had returned. The haunted look in her eyes replaced by a quiet watchfulness. The agreement had been for her to leave once she was well, a fact that hung between them, unspoken and heavy. Yet, with each sunrise that brought a new veil of dust, Elias would look to the sky and state, with a finality that brooked no argument, "No one travels in this. You'll be lost or buried in an hour." He used the weather as a shield, a convenient and undeniable reason to keep her at the ranch. He was a man who lived by practicalities, and the storms were a perfect, practical excuse. It allowed him to avoid examining the real reason. The thought of the house returning to its former silence was now unbearable. He had grown accustomed to the soft sounds of her presence, the quiet hum of a hymn as she kneaded dough, the gentle scrape of her chair by the fire in the evenings. These small things had seeped into the cracks of his fortified heart, and he was not yet ready or willing to chisel them out. He told himself it was a matter of safety, of basic human decency. He did not dare give it the name of the feeling that was slowly, terrifyingly, beginning to grow within him. Miriam, for her part, did not protest. She accepted his pronouncements with a quiet nod, her gaze flickering towards the raging dust outside the window. Whether she stayed out of fear of the journey or for reasons of her own, she did not say. Their days settled into a new domestic rhythm, a partnership forged in silence and shared tasks. They moved around each other with a practiced grace, the vast, unspoken chasm of their pasts bridged by the simple, immediate needs of survival. The reversal came on a deceptively clear afternoon. The wind had died down, and a fragile peace had settled over the land. Elias had ridden out to mend a section of fence on the north pasture, a task he'd put off for weeks. He was working near a rocky outcrop when his horse, a steady, reliable gelding named Abel, suddenly shied. A low, dry rattle sounded from the rocks, the unmistakable warning of a cornered rattlesnake. Abel reared in terror, his powerful body twisting. Elias caught off guard, fought for his seat, but the horse's panic was absolute. He was thrown, his body hitting the hard-packed earth with a sickening impact. A blinding, white-hot flash of pain erupted in his left shoulder, followed by a nauseating wave of blackness. When his vision cleared, he knew. The angle of his arm, the grinding sensation of bone on bone whenever he tried to move. It was a bad break. Gritting his teeth against a pain that threatened to swallow him whole, he struggled to his feet. Abel. His panic subsided, stood a few yards away, trembling. Getting back on the horse was an agony Elias would not have thought possible to endure. Every jostle of the ride back to the ranch was a fresh torment, the world blurring at the edges. Miriam was drawing water from the well when she saw him. He was slumped over the saddle, his face the color of ash, his left arm held at a grotesque angle. She dropped the bucket with a splash, her heart seizing in her chest. For a moment, she was frozen, the image of another broken man from her past flashing before her eyes. But this was Elias, the man who had cut her ropes, the man who had wept in the dark. She ran. She helped him dismount, his dead weight nearly taking her down with him. She guided him into the house, his breath coming in ragged, pain-filled gasps, and eased him into a chair by the hearth. There was no doctor for 50 miles. There was only her, drawing on a well of strength she didn't know she possessed. She took control. She gave him a generous pour of whiskey for the pain. Then, with his own knife, she slit his shirt from his shoulder. The sight of the bone, unnaturally prominent beneath the skin, made her stomach churn, but she forced the feeling down. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You have to hold still. Do you understand, Elias?" He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain but clear with trust. He gave a single, sharp nod. The work that followed was a grim, intimate ballet of pain and resolve, with Miriam guiding him and Elias biting down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming. They managed to set the bone. The sound it made slipping back into place was something neither of them would ever forget. She bound his shoulder and chest tightly with torn strips of linen, fashioning a sling to keep his arm immobile. For the next 2 weeks, the roles were utterly reversed. Elias, the strong, self-sufficient rancher, was rendered as helpless as a child. He was a man imprisoned by his own body, and Miriam became his keeper. She fed him, brought him water, helped him dress, and tended to the fire. She did it all with a gentle, unwavering patience that chipped away at the last of his defenses. In the feverish, pain-filled nights, he would wake from nightmares of fire and smoke, and she would be there, a cool cloth for his head, a quiet word to soothe him back to sleep. He, who had never relied on anyone, was now completely at her mercy, and her mercy was absolute. One evening, as she was changing the dressing on his shoulder, he spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "The fire, it was my fault." Miriam paused, her hands still. She had never asked about his wife, sensing it was a place of sorrow too sacred to approach uninvited. "It started in the barn," he said, his gaze fixed on the far wall, on a past only he could see. A lantern tipped. The hay went up like tinder. The wind was blowing toward the house that night, a hot, dry wind, like the ones we've been having. He took a ragged breath. Sarah, she went back inside, for a box, a small wooden box with her mother's letters in it. It was all she had of her. His good hand clenched into a fist on his lap. "The roof collapsed. I heard it. I was right there, at the door. The heat, it was like a furnace door opening. I tried to go in after her, but the smoke, I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. And I was afraid." The last words were a whisper, a confession of a sin he had held in his heart for 5 years. "I was afraid. I stood there, and my wife burned. And I did nothing." He finally looked at her, his eyes hollowed out by guilt. "A man who can't protect his own wife. He doesn't deserve to love another. He doesn't deserve anything." Tears streamed down Miriam's face, silent and hot. They were not tears of pity, but of a fierce, aching empathy for the man before her, for the impossible weight he had forced himself to carry. She saw his pain, a mirror to her own, a different kind of wound from a different kind of fire, but just as deep, just as searing. She finished her work, her movements slow and deliberate. Then, she did something she had never dared to do before. She knelt in front of his chair and gently, reverently, placed her hand on his chest, directly over his heart. He flinched at the contact, but he did not pull away. She could feel the frantic, wounded beating beneath her palm. "You were a victim of the fire, too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It took her from you. It wasn't your fault. Some things are too big to fight." She looked directly into his eyes, willing him to understand. "She needs to be forgiven for going back in. And you need to be forgiven, too." The dam inside him broke. A great shuddering sob escaped him, the sound of a soul cracking open. He leaned forward, his head falling until his forehead rested against her shoulder. And he wept. He wept for Sarah, for his own weakness, for the cold, empty years, and for the impossible grace of the woman who was holding him together. A few nights later, the raw intimacy of that confession still hung in the air between them. He was stronger. The pain in his shoulder a dull ache instead of a sharp agony. They sat by the fire, the silence comfortable now, companionable. He was watching her as she read from a worn copy of the Bible she had salvaged from the wreckage of her wagon. The firelight softened the tired lines around her eyes and caught the gentle curve of her mouth. He saw not a runaway, not a burden, but a woman of incredible strength and quiet beauty. Slowly, he reached out with his good hand. He did not touch her body, but gently cupped her chin, tilting her face toward his. His eyes searched hers, filled with a question he did not know how to ask. His calloused thumb stroked her cheek, a touch of almost unbearable tenderness. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. She saw the longing there, the raw, naked want, and her own breath caught in her throat. His fingers brushed her lips, a feather-light touch that sent a tremor through her entire body. It was a promise, a beginning. And then, just as quickly, it was over. A shadow passed over his face. Fear, stark and absolute. The ghost of the fire, the specter of his guilt, the terror of allowing his heart to feel again, it all rushed back in a devastating tide. He pulled his hand away as if her skin had burned him. He turned his head, staring into the fire, his entire body rigid, his jaw clenched tight. The moment was shattered, the fragile connection broken. Miriam sat frozen, the warmth of his touch still tingling on her skin, a hollow ache spreading through her chest. The rejection was as sharp and sudden as a slap. But as she looked at the rigid line of his back, the visible war he was fighting within himself, she felt a wave of confusion. She did not know if she was heartbroken because he had turned away from her asterisk, or because he was so profoundly terrified of letting himself love at all. The fragile peace forged in the crucible of Elias's recovery could not last. It was a hothouse flower, cultivated in the isolation of the ranch, and it was never meant for the harsh climate of the outside world. As Elias's shoulder healed, their supplies dwindled, and a trip to Prescott became unavoidable. Elias felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his gut. He had not set foot in town with another person at his side in 5 years, and the person he was with now was Miriam, a woman who carried her history like a shadow. The town of Prescott had not changed. It was a place of false-fronted buildings and hard, judgmental eyes, a community that held its secrets tight and its opinions loosely. The moment they stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, Elias felt the shift. He saw the whispers that passed from one woman to another behind a gloved hand. He saw the way the men in front of the saloon stopped their conversation to stare, their gazes lingering on Miriam with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Silas Croft, the mail carrier, had done his work well. The story of the widower Harper and the runaway woman he was keeping had become common currency. The final, brutal confirmation came in the mercantile. Miriam, her spirit buoyed by the prospect of something new, had approached a bolt of deep blue calico, the color of a twilight sky. It was a small, hopeful luxury, a whisper of a life beyond mere survival. She ran her hand over the fabric, a faint smile on her lips. "I'll take 2 yards of this, please," she said to the storekeeper's wife, a stern, waspish woman named Mrs. Gable. The woman looked from the fabric to Miriam, her eyes as cold and hard as river stones. She wiped her hands on her apron, a gesture of deliberate and insulting purification. "We're not selling to you," she said, her voice loud enough for half the store to hear. Miriam froze, her hand recoiling from the fabric as if it had turned red hot. The color drained from her face. I have money." "It's not about money." Mrs. Gable sniffed, looking down her nose. "This is a decent establishment for decent folk. We don't cater to your kind." The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Asterisk your kind. A soiled dove, a fallen woman, a dirty widow living in sin with a grieving rancher. Every unspoken judgment of the town was contained in that simple, vicious phrase. Elias, who had been negotiating for a sack of beans at the far counter, turned. He saw the raw humiliation on Miriam's face, the circle of smug, staring faces around her, a black, cold rage, the likes of which he had not felt since the fire, rose in his chest. He took a step forward, his hand clenched into a fist, every instinct screaming at him to tear the place apart. But then he saw Miriam. She straightened her back, her chin held high, though he could see the tremor in her hands. She met Mrs. Gable's gaze with a look of quiet, heartbreaking dignity, and then turned and walked out of the store without a word. Elias dropped a coin on the counter to cover his purchase and followed her, the whispers of the townsfolk like hornets at his back. The ride home was cloaked in a heavy, miserable silence. The joy of the outing was dead, replaced by the bitter taste of shame. Elias wanted to say something, to offer a word of comfort, but what could he say? He knew this world. He knew its casual cruelty, its rigid, unforgiving codes. By bringing Miriam into his home, he had inadvertently placed her in its stocks for public ridicule. They arrived at the ranch to find a man leaning against the corral fence as if he owned it. He was a stranger, dressed in clothes a little too fine for the trail, with a slick, oiled haircut and a smile that was all teeth. A cold dread washed over Elias as he saw the look of pure, animal terror that flashed across Miriam's face. She looked like a rabbit that had just spotted a hawk. The man pushed himself off the fence and sauntered toward them, his smile widening. "Miriam, my dear, I've been worried half to death about you. It took me months to track you down." "Finch," she breathed, the name like a curse. "Now, is that any way to greet your husband?" he chided, though his eyes, small and dark, held no warmth. "I've come to take you home, to forgive and forget. We can make things right. You and I—" This was the man she had fled, the one who had sold her, the one who had beaten her spirit into the dust. Elias didn't need to hear the details. He could read the entire brutal story in the way Miriam shrank away from him. Elias dismounted slowly, placing himself between Finch and Miriam. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice a low growl. Finch's smile faltered for a second. He sized Elias up, the broad shoulders, the calloused hands, the cold, murderous promise in his eyes. "Now, see here, friend," he said, trying for a conciliatory tone. "This is a private matter between a man and his wife, a sacred arrangement. The law is on my side." "There's the law," Elias said, taking a step closer. "And then there's what happens out here. Get on your horse and ride away, and I'll forget I ever saw your face." Finch, emboldened by his supposed legal standing, made a fatal mistake. He sneered. "You think you can keep her? A used-up, runaway mail-order bride? She's my property. I paid good money for her." He reached out, as if to push Elias aside and grab Miriam's arm. He never touched him. Elias moved with a speed that was terrifying. The rage he had suppressed in the mercantile, the fury from 5 years of grief, the primal, protective instinct that now burned in him for the woman behind him. It all coalesced into a single, devastating blow. His fist connected with Finch's jaw with a sickening crack of bone. The man's head snapped back, his eyes rolling up, and he crumpled to the ground in a heap, unconscious before he even landed. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rising wind and Elias's own ragged breathing. He stood over the fallen man, his knuckles split and bleeding, his chest heaving. He had done it. He had faced down her past and vanquished it. He turned to Miriam, expecting, what? Relief? Gratitude? He saw only despair. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror. "Now they'll have another story to tell," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The crazy widower who beat a man half to death for his whore." She looked from the unconscious form of Finch to Elias's bloodied hand, and something inside her broke. "I have to leave." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. "What? He's gone. I handled it. You're safe here." He couldn't understand. He had solved the problem. "Don't you see, Elias?" she cried, tears finally streaming down her face. "The problem isn't him. It's me. I am the trouble. I saw their faces in town. I see what I'm bringing to your door. They will never leave you be as long as I am here. I will not be the ruin of you." His mind, reeling from the adrenaline and the shock of her words, twisted her selfless act into a blade of betrayal. He heard only rejection. "So that's it? Your past comes calling, and you run? Is that what this was all about? Just a place to hide? A temporary shelter until you had to run again?" The words were cruel, born of his deepest fear, that he was nothing more than a convenience, a stepping stone. "That's not true," she sobbed. "You know that's not true." "Do I?" he shot back, his hurt curdling into anger. "You were ready to leave before. You're ready to leave now. It seems all it takes is a little trouble for you to pack your bags." He couldn't say the words that were screaming in his heart. "Don't go. Stay with me. I need you." All he could do was lash out, to wound her before she could wound him further. Her face crumpled, and he knew he had struck a fatal blow. Without another word, she turned and walked into the house. He was left standing over the body of a man he'd nearly killed, the victor of a battle who had just lost the entire war. An hour later, as a cold, miserable rain began to fall, she emerged from the house. She carried a small bundle of her belongings. Her face was pale but resolved. As she passed him, she hesitated. "Thank you, Elia, for everything." He couldn't speak. His pride and his pain had built a wall of silence around him, and he could only stand there, rigid and mute, as she walked past him, down the muddy track that led away from the ranch. He watched until her small figure was swallowed by the rain and the gathering dusk. As she disappeared, he noticed something clutched in her hand. It was a small silk scarf, the color of a twilight sky, the one he had bought for her in town and left on her bed without a word. That night, the house was a tomb. The silence he had once cherished now screamed at him, amplifying the sound of the rain and the hollow beating of his own heart. He was consumed by a wild, directionless fury, at Finch, at the town, at Miriam, but most of all, at himself. He needed to destroy something. He went to the barn, his lantern cutting a weak yellow swath through the darkness. He began to gather every piece of old, rotten rope he could find. Frayed lariats, broken reins, lengths of hemp that were stiff with age and mildew. The rope he had found her in, the kind of rope he had been mending that night by the fire. He carried it all, armful after armful, out into the middle of the corral, the cold rain plastering his hair to his skull. He built a pyre of it in the mud and, after dousing it with kerosene, he threw the lantern on top. The pile erupted in a whoosh of greasy orange flame, the fire hissing and spitting as it fought against the rain. He stood there, soaked to the bone, watching the bindings burn. It was a mad, desperate act, a symbolic pyre for his own powerlessness. He was burning the very idea of holding her, of tying her to him. He was setting her free, but it was a hollow gesture, because he knew, as the flames cast his solitary, trembling shadow across the muddy ground, that he had never wanted to bind her. He had only wanted her to choose to stay, and he had been too much of a coward to ask. The rain that had served as the bleak backdrop to Miriam's departure eventually exhausted itself. leaving behind a world washed in shades of gray and brown. For Miriam, the road was not a path to a destination, but an endless, repeating lesson in rejection. She walked until her feet were raw, driven by a desperate, fading hope of finding a place where she could simply be invisible. At the first homestead she came to, a tidy cabin with a curl of smoke promising warmth, a woman eyed her from a cracked open door, her face a mask of suspicion. Before Miriam could even speak, the woman said, "We've got nothing for vagrants," and the door was shut, the bolt sliding home with a sound of absolute finality. At the next, a larger ranch with a dozen hands working the corral. The foreman listened to her quiet plea for a day's work in exchange for a meal. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl, a slow, insolent appraisal that was all too familiar. "We might have work for a woman like you," he'd said with a greasy smile. "But it ain't in the kitchen." She had turned and fled, his mocking laughter following her down the long, dusty track. Word of her, it seemed, traveled faster than she did. She was the runaway, the fallen woman, the source of trouble. Each closed door, each contemptuous stare, was another grain of salt rubbed into the raw wound of her past. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her memories began to crumble. The faces of the homesteaders blurred with the face of Finch, and his with the face of her first husband. All of them looked at her and saw the same thing, not a person, but a thing to be used, judged or discarded. A panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at her from the inside. She was worthless. She was a burden. Elias had been right to let her go. The thought was a relentless torment, twisting his pained, angry face into the same mask of condemnation as all the others. She wandered for days, growing weaker, the cold from that first night's rain seeping deep into her bones. Finally, utterly spent, she stumbled upon a place that offered no judgment because it was devoid of life, an abandoned homestead. The cabin had long ago collapsed into a pile of rotting lumber, but the barn, though sagging and full of holes, still stood. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of hay and livestock. She found an empty stall, the dirt floor covered in dry, brittle straw, and collapsed. As dusk fell, bringing a sharp chill to the air, she curled into a tight ball, her body racked with shivers that had nothing to do with the cold. The silk scarf, her only possession of value, her only link to a moment of unspoken tenderness, was clutched in her hand. She held it to her cheek, but its remembered warmth was no match for the profound, soul-deep chill that was setting in. She fell into a fevered, restless sleep, haunted by a chaotic nightmare of flames and ropes and doors slamming shut in her face. Back at the ranch, Elias was living in his own private hell. The first night, his rage and the fire had kept the silence at bay. But when the flames died and the rain stopped, the quiet that descended on the house was a physical presence. It was a suffocating, accusing silence, shaped exactly like her. Every object was a fresh torment. The chair she'd sat in by the fire, the neatly mended shirt she had folded and left on his bed, the faint, lingering scent of baked bread in the kitchen. He had chased her away. He had taken her selfless, desperate act of protection and twisted it into a selfish betrayal. He had seen the truth in her eyes and had been too proud and too afraid to accept it. The memory of his cruel words played over and over in his mind, each syllable a lash of self-loathing. Asterisk. Was this all just a place to hide? He had hurled his own deepest fears at her, and she had shattered under the weight. He didn't sleep for 3 nights. He paced the small cabin like a caged animal, the silence roaring in his ears. He would go out to the corral and stare at the muddy, blackened scar where the ropes had burned, a monument to his own spectacular failure. He had been so obsessed with not binding her. He had failed to realize that all she had needed was for him to open his hand and ask her to stay. He had found her tied with rope, but he had driven her away with words, which were a far more cruel and effective restraint. On the morning of the 4th day, something inside him broke. The agony of her absence finally became greater than the fear of his own heart. Regret was a passive, useless thing. It would not bring her back. He strode to the barn, his movements filled with a desperate, new purpose. He saddled Abel, his hands sure and swift. He did not know where she was going, but he knew he had to find her. He had to undo the damage he had done. He rode out, his eyes scanning the ground, searching for the faint impressions of her worn boots in the damp earth. He was a good tracker, his skills honed by years of pursuing lost cattle. But this was different. This was not a matter of property, but of penance. The landscape was a brutal, indifferent canvas for his search. The sun, which had hidden behind clouds and dust for weeks, now re-emerged with a vengeance, beating down on him, cracking the mud and baking the earth. The heat was relentless, the air thick with shimmering waves that distorted the horizon, creating phantom figures that would mock him for a moment before dissolving back into the light. He followed the faint trail for 2 days, his hope dwindling with each passing mile. He found the places she had been rejected, reading the story in the tracks that led up to a gate and then immediately away from it. He felt a white-hot rage at the people who had turned her away, a rage that was quickly extinguished by the cold shame of knowing he had been the one to send her to their doors in the first place. By the end of the 2nd day, he was losing the trail in the dry, wind-swept plains. Desperation gnawed at him. He was about to give up, to turn back to his empty home and his empty life, when he saw it, a faint, dark shape on the horizon, almost lost in the haze, a sagging roofline, an abandoned barn. He spurred Abel onward, his heart hammering against his ribs with a mixture of hope and terror. As he drew closer, he could see the place was derelict, a skeleton picked clean by the wind and the sun. He dismounted, his legs stiff, and approached the wide, dark opening of the barn. "Miriam," he called out, his voice hoarse. The only answer was the whisper of the wind through the broken slats of the walls. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The air was heavy and still, and then he saw her. She was in a stall in the far corner, a small, curled shape in the straw. So still he feared the worst. He rushed to her side and knelt, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch her shoulder. She was burning with fever. Her face was flushed, her lips cracked and dry. She was muttering, her head tossing back and forth in the throes of a delirium. He leaned closer to hear the broken words. "So cold, the door is locked, please." Her voice was a phantom of itself, thin and desperate. She whimpered, a lost, childlike sound that shattered what was left of his heart. And then she said his name. "Elias, the fire, it's so hot, Elias!" She was trapped in a nightmare woven from her own past and his. In her delirium, her broken mind had reached for him. It was an absolution and a condemnation all at once. He had become a part of her suffering, but he was also the one she called out for. He didn't hesitate. There were no words. Words were useless now. They were the weapons he had used to drive her away. Only action could atone. He gently gathered her into his arms, her body frighteningly limp, and lifted her from the straw. She moaned softly, her head falling against his chest. He pulled his coat from his saddle, wrapping it around her shivering frame, and swung himself onto Abel's back, settling her in front of him. He held her tightly against his body, her head nestled in the curve of his shoulder, one arm wrapped securely around her waist. He turned the horse for home and urged him into a steady, ground-eating pace. The journey back was a silent, desperate prayer. He did not speak. He did not stop. He simply held her, a fierce, protective shield against the harshness of the world, his chin resting on the top of her head, his entire being focused on the single, overwhelming need to get her home. He was taking back what he had thrown away, carrying his own fragile, battered heart all the way back to the shelter of the ranch. The first thing Miriam knew was warmth, not the raging, internal heat of fever, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to seep into her very bones. It was the warmth of a thick quilt, a soft mattress, and a room sealed against the chill of the night. She drifted in this pleasant limbo for a long time, untethered from thought or memory, content in the simple, animal comfort of it. Slowly, consciousness returned, bringing with it the geography of a familiar room, the rough-hewn wooden ceiling, the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke from the stone hearth, the single window, now a dark gray square against the coming dawn. She was back in Elias's house, in his bed. Panic, a cold and familiar reflex, tried to seize her. She had been found, captured. A wave of memory washed over her. The cold barn, the shivering, the descent into a chaotic darkness filled with menacing faces and slamming doors. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, her body feeling weak and hollowed out. She looked down at her hands, expecting to see them bound, a symbol of her capture, but they were free. They lay on top of the quilt, clean and pale in the dim light. The palms and fingers, which had been scraped raw from her journey, were carefully cleaned and wrapped in soft strips of linen. Someone had tended to her with a gentle, meticulous care. She flexed her fingers, the movement clumsy but unimpeded. She was not a prisoner. The door creaked open, and Elias entered, carrying a tin cup of water. He moved quietly, as if not to wake her, and for a moment he didn't realize her eyes were open. In the faint light, his face looked haggard, etched with lines of exhaustion and a deep, gut-wrenching worry that he had not bothered to hide. When he saw she was awake, the worry was instantly replaced by a wave of profound, unguarded relief that softened the hard planes of his face. He stopped a few feet from the bed, holding the cup, suddenly uncertain. The air was thick with all the things they had left unsaid, with the cruel words he had thrown at her and the desperate flight that had followed. Miriam found her voice, a dry, fragile whisper. "You found me." He nodded, his throat working. He stepped forward and held the cup to her lips, his hands steady. She drank greedily, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. He took the cup away and looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all its former defenses. He saw her glance down at her bandaged, unbound hands, and he understood. "This time," he said, his voice low and raspy with emotion. "You don't have to ask me to untie you. You're free, Miriam, free to stay, free to go. The choice is yours. There are no more ropes." The simple words undid her completely. It wasn't just about the hemp that had bound her wrists that first day. It was about the unspoken bindings of obligation, of debt, of being a burden. He was offering her not just shelter, but autonomy. He was giving her back her own will, the one thing that had been taken from her by every other person in her life. A great, shuddering sob broke from her, a sound of grief and gratitude and a release so profound it left her breathless. Tears she hadn't known she had left to cry streamed down her face. "I'm sorry," she wept, the words tumbling out between sobs. "I'm so sorry. Elias, I ran because I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear being the thing that brought shame to your door. I heard what they said. I saw how they looked at you. I thought if I left, I would be setting you free." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "I didn't believe you could truly want someone like me, someone so broken. I didn't trust you." He sat on the edge of the bed, a movement that was both tentative and momentous. It was the closest he had ever willingly been to her. He reached out, his calloused hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed the tears from her cheek. His touch was warm and real. "It is I who should be sorry," he said, his voice thick. "My words, they were cruel, unforgivable. I was a coward. Miriam, I took my own fear and I used it as a weapon against you." He looked away, toward the window, as if the confession was too difficult to make while looking at her. "When Sarah died, when I stood there and watched my whole world burn, something inside me burned with it. I thought it was just grief, but it was more than that. It was fear. the kind of fear that gets into your bones and stays there. He finally turned back to her, his faded blue eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. Love, to me, is not a gentle thing. It's not a comfort. It's the thing you have that the world can take away in a heartbeat. It's a promise of loss. It's a memory that festers like a wound that will not heal. I was so terrified of that pain, of feeling that emptiness again, that I built a fortress around myself. And then you came. You walked right through the walls without even trying. He took a shaky breath, the confession costing him everything. I was falling in love with you, Miriam, and it terrified me, because to love you meant that I could lose you. So I drove you away. I pushed you out into the storm, because I was too much of a coward to face the one inside my own heart. His admission hung in the quiet room, a truth so profound and vulnerable. It seemed to have a weight of its own. He had not let her go out of anger. He had let her go out of a love so deep and so terrifying that he could not bear it. She saw it all now, his coldness, his retreat by the fire, his cruel words, not as rejections of her, but as the desperate, panicked actions of a man petrified by the thawing of his own frozen soul. She reached out and placed her bandaged hand over his. We are two sides of the same coin, Elias Harper, she whispered. You are afraid to love, and I'm afraid to be loved. That night, a gentle rain began to fall, a soft, steady drumming on the roof that insulated them from the rest of the world. The fever had broken, and Miriam, though still weak, was able to sit in the chair by the hearth while Elias cooked a simple broth. They didn't speak much, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the things they had finally said. A quiet, comfortable space where they could simply be. After they had eaten, he lit a single candle on the mantelpiece, its small flame casting a warm, flickering glow that pushed the shadows into the corners of the room. The rain whispered against the window pane. The fire crackled softly. In the small, intimate world created by the light and the storm, there was nothing left but the two of them. He was standing by the hearth, and she was in her chair. The space between them felt charged, a current of unspoken need passing back and forth. All the barriers were gone. Their secrets were laid bare, their wounds exposed to the soft, healing light of the fire. There was nothing left to hide behind. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a lifetime of loneliness and a desperate, rising tide of want. She saw the man who had cut her ropes, the man who had wept for his own loss, the man who had ridden into the merciless desert to bring her home. She rose from her chair, her legs a little unsteady, and walked toward him. She stopped just before him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She looked up into his face, and with a courage she did not know she possessed, she reached up and laid her palm against his rough, unshaven cheek. A tremor went through him at her touch. He closed his eyes, leaning into her hand as if it were an anchor in a storm. Slowly, reverently, he brought his own hand up to cover hers, his calloused fingers lacing with her own against his skin. He opened his eyes, and the raw hunger in them made her breath catch. He lowered his head, his movements agonizingly slow, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not move. She stood her ground, meeting his gaze, accepting all that he was offering, all his pain, all his fear, all his love. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of fire and passion, but something far more profound. It was a kiss of devastating tenderness, of desperation and relief. It was salty with the taste of tears, both hers and his. It was a kiss that sought not to take, but to give. A silent, sacred vow to a future that had, until this moment, seemed impossible. His arms came around her, pulling her against his strong, solid frame, and she melted into him, her hands moving from his face to tangle in his hair. It was a homecoming, for him, a return from a 5-year exile of the heart. For her, the discovery of the first true home she had ever known. They were not two broken people anymore. In the warm, flickering light of the cabin, surrounded by the gentle, cleansing sound of the rain. They were two souls, scarred but not shattered, finally, miraculously, becoming whole. The weeks that followed Miriam's recovery unfolded into a season of quiet grace. A fragile, unspoken peace settled over the ranch, as gentle and welcome as the spring rains that finally came to wash the dust from the air. They lived together in a way that had no name but was as real and binding as any vow spoken before a preacher. They were not husband and wife, for no words of commitment had been exchanged, but they were partners in every sense of the word. Their days found a simple, harmonious rhythm. Miriam brought the house to life. The scent of baking bread became a permanent resident, a warm, yeasty counterpoint to the masculine smells of leather and earth that had defined the space for so long. She started a small garden, coaxing stubborn green shoots of beans and squash from the unforgiving soil. On market days, she would ride into Prescott, head held a little higher now, to sell her surplus bread and eggs. Some people, like the mercantile owner's wife, Mrs. Gable, still met her with a stony glare. But others, seeing the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, would offer a polite nod or even a small, hesitant smile. Elias, in turn, began to rebuild his world. He repaired the fences he had neglected, reshingled the barn roof, and worked his land with a renewed vigor. The presence of Miriam was a quiet fuel for his labors. Coming home from a long day in the saddle to the sight of a light in the window and the promise of a warm meal was a gift he had long ago believed was lost to him forever. The deep, weary sadness in his eyes was replaced by a steady, watchful tenderness. The fortress around his heart had been dismantled, brick by painful brick, and in its place stood a home. They spoke little of the future, content to live in the simple, precious present they were building, a life that felt, at long last, like a destination. This peaceful illusion was shattered on a bright Tuesday morning in May. They were in the corral, Elias showing Miriam how to properly groom a horse, when a rider approached. It was Sheriff Brody, a tall, somber man with a drooping mustache and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much of the territory's troubles. "Morning, Elias, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but firm as he reined in his horse. He did not dismount. "Sheriff," Elias replied, his body tensing, his hand moving to rest instinctively on Miriam's shoulder. "What brings you all the way out here?" Sheriff Brody cleared his throat, his gaze settling on Miriam with an expression of profound reluctance. "I'm afraid this isn't a social call. I have a warrant here from the circuit judge. A warrant for the arrest of one Miriam Farrow, also known as Miriam Finch." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Miriam felt the blood drain from her face, her hand flying to her mouth. Elias's grip on her shoulder tightened, becoming a protective anchor. "A warrant for what?" Elias's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "For the murder of Jedediah Finch," the sheriff said, his words falling like stones into the quiet morning air. "His brother filed the complaint, found Finch's body a few weeks back in an arroyo a day's ride from here. Said his jaw was broken and he'd been left for dead. The coroner reckons he died of exposure, but the complaint says it was this woman here, and the man she ran off with, who put him there." Elias stepped forward, placing himself fully in front of Miriam. A human shield. "That's a damn lie. Finch showed up here looking for trouble. He was a snake, and he got what he deserved. I'm the one who hit him. If you're arresting anyone, you're arresting me." Sheriff Brody sighed, a sound of deep frustration. "I figured as much, Elias, but the warrant is for her. The complaint says she lured him out here so her new man could kill him. I don't have a choice in the matter. I have to bring her in." "No," Elias said, the word as final and unmovable as the mountains on the horizon. "You're not taking her." The sheriff's hand drifted down to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Elias, don't make this difficult. I'm just doing my job. You stand in my way, and I'll have to add obstructing justice to the list of charges." For a long, tense moment, the two men stared each other down, but then Miriam's voice, quiet but steady, came from behind Elias.
"It's all right, Elias, I'll go."
He turned to her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury.
"Miriam, no, we can fight this."
"We will," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his rigid arm. "But not like this. I will not have you shot or thrown in jail on my account. I am tired of running. I will go with him, and I will face them, and I will tell the truth." The trial was a spectacle. The small, dusty courtroom in Prescott was packed to the rafters, the air thick with the heat of too many bodies and the buzz of morbid curiosity. The town was, as the gossip had predicted, split down the middle. One side of the room was filled with faces like Mrs. Gables, stern and self-righteous, eager to see the fallen woman get her due. The other side was filled with a quieter, more watchful crowd. Other ranchers who respected Elias, women who knew the sting of a harsh judgment, and those who were simply waiting to hear the story for themselves. The prosecutor was a slick, ambitious man from back east who painted Miriam as a scheming seductress, a black widow who had lured a man to his doom. He twisted her past into a sordid tale of infidelity and greed. When it was her turn to take the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. She looked small and fragile in the witness box, but when she spoke, her voice was clear and did not tremble. She did not look at the prosecutor, or the judge, or the hostile faces in the crowd. She looked at Elias, who sat in the front row, his gaze locked on hers, a silent, unwavering source of strength. And she told them everything. She spoke of being a young, hopeful widow, answering an advertisement that promised a new life. She spoke of arriving in a desolate town to meet a man whose eyes were cold and whose hands were hard. She told them of the beatings, of the constant, soul-crushing humiliation of a life that was no better than slavery. She told them, her voice cracking for the first time, of her son, Samuel, who had lived for 2 days and was buried like an animal behind a smokehouse. She told them of how Finch had sold her contract to another man for the price of a good horse, and how she had finally run. She described being hunted, being found, and being tied up like cattle. She recounted her rescue, her illness, and the quiet, gentle care she had received at the hands of the man the prosecutor was trying to paint as her accomplice.
Mr. Finch came to the ranch not to reclaim his wife," she said, her voice ringing with a righteous clarity, "but to reclaim his property. He said so himself. He said he had paid good money for me. Elias Harper did not strike him for a lover. He struck him for a woman's honor, because Mr. Finch saw none in me. He saw only an object he had bought and paid for."
When she finished, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a thick, heavy silence, filled with the weight of her truth. The prosecutor, for the first time, seemed at a loss for words. The faces in the crowd were no longer smug or curious, but stunned, sobered by the raw, unvarnished pain of her testimony. Into that silence, a new voice arose. A woman from the back of the courtroom, a widow named Martha Sweeney, whom Miriam recognized from the market, slowly got to her feet. She was a plain, work-worn woman, and all eyes turned to her.
"I have lived in this territory for 30 years,
she said, her voice strong and clear.
"I have buried a husband and 2 sons. I know what hardship is,
and I know what it is to be a woman alone in a world that is not always kind." She looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. "We have all heard the whispers about this woman. We have passed our judgments in the street and over our fences. But I ask you now, having heard her story, who among us has the right to cast the first stone? Who among us can claim to know the measure of a person's suffering, or the desperate things they might do to survive it?" She looked directly at the judge.
"We are who we are, but we are not God.
And this courtroom is not the final judgment." She sat down. The spell was broken. A murmur went through the crowd, a rustle of shifting sympathies. The judge, a stern but fair man, looked at Miriam for a long moment, then at the prosecutor, and finally at the jury. The verdict. When it came an hour later, was a formality. Not guilty. A wave of relief so powerful it nearly buckled Miriam's knees washed over her. Elias was at her side in an instant, his strong arm around her, holding her up. They had won. She was free. But as they walked out of the courthouse into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, she knew that the widow's words, while true, were not the whole story. The law had absolved her, but the town had not. They passed through a gauntlet of stares. Some were looks of newfound respect and sympathy, but many others were still cold, filled with the lingering poison of suspicion. She had been cleared of murder, but she had not been cleansed of her past. She was, and perhaps always would be, the runaway woman, the source of scandal. The trial was over, but the stain, she feared, remained. The verdict was a legal fact, but it was not the truth of their lives. In the days that followed the trial, a subtle but undeniable chill followed Elias and Miriam from the town back to the isolation of the ranch. The looks they received were no longer just hostile. They were tinged with a morbid fascination. Elias, once the solitary, respected widower, was now a character in a sordid town drama. Men who once shared a drink with him at the saloon now fell silent when he entered. Women who once offered a polite nod now herded their children away, as if he and Miriam were carriers of some moral plague. Miriam saw it all. She saw the way Elias's jaw would tighten when they rode through Prescott. She saw the casual cruelties, a merchant accidentally shortchanging them, a group of boys whispering murderer just loud enough for her to hear. She had been acquitted in a court of law, but she stood condemned in the court of public opinion, and Elias, by standing with her, was condemned as well. He never spoke of it. He stood by her side, a silent, unbreachable wall of support. But she saw the cost. She saw the way his world, the one he had so carefully rebuilt after the fire, was shrinking, becoming a place of isolation not by his choice, but by the town's decree. The love they shared within the walls of their home was a perfect, beautiful thing, a sanctuary. But the moment they stepped outside, that love became a brand, a mark of shame that he was forced to wear because of her. And she could not bear it. She had spent her life as a burden to others, a source of trouble. She would not, could not, be that for him. The man who had saved her deserved more than a life lived in the shadows of her past. Her decision was a quiet agony, made in the dead of night as she watched him sleep, his face finally peaceful in the moonlight. To stay was to love him selfishly, to allow her presence to slowly poison his life. To leave was to love him truly, to cut the cord that tied him to her own damaged reputation. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than fleeing Finch, harder than facing the courtroom. This was not an act of fear, but an act of love, a final, painful, and necessary sacrifice. She waited for a day when he rode out to the far pastures to check on a newborn calf. She worked quickly, her hands trembling but her purpose firm. She baked a loaf of bread and left it on the table. She scrubbed the floors and made the bed. She put the house in perfect order, a final, silent testament to the life she was leaving behind. On the pillow where her head had rested, she left a single, folded piece of paper. She had labored over the words, writing and rewriting them until they conveyed the precise, aching truth of her heart. Asterisk, my dearest Elias. Asterisk, you found me bound in rope, and you set me free. You found me bound in fear, and you set me free. You found me bound in a past I could not escape, and you fought for me until I was free. I have never known such freedom. I have never known such love. Asterisk. And so now, I must ask one last thing of you. Asterisk. Please, I am begging you, untie it. Asterisk. The love that you hold for me, it was never meant to be a rope that binds you to the scorn of this town. It must be a thing that sets you free, as I am now. Because of you, do not follow. Live your life in the sun. You have earned it. Asterisk yours, always. Asterisk Miriam asterisk.
She took nothing with her but the clothes on her back and the silk scarf he had given her, now tucked safely in her pocket. She did not look back as she started down the long road. Each step an act of will, a tear for every foot of dust she put between herself and the only true home she had ever known. When Elias returned that evening, the silence that greeted him was wrong. It was not the companionable quiet of a shared life, but the dead, hollow silence of abandonment. He saw the uneaten loaf of bread on the table, and a cold dread seized him. He strode into the bedroom, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm, and he saw the note. He read it once, his mind refusing to comprehend the words. He read it a second time, and a raw, animal sound of pure anguish was torn from his throat. Untie it. She thought his love for her was a restraint, a chain holding him down. After everything, after all they had been through, she still believed she was a burden to be shed. He did not hesitate. The fury and despair he felt were channeled into a single, clarifying purpose. He ran to the barn, throwing the saddle on Abel with a speed born of pure desperation. He had let her walk away once out of pride and fear. He would not make that mistake again. This was not about pride. This was about his life, his future, his very soul, which was at that moment walking away from him down a dusty road. He rode like a man possessed, his eyes scanning the trail, the setting sun casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape. The world was awash in the fiery colors of twilight, deep oranges, blood reds, and bruised purples. He pushed the horse harder, his mind a maelstrom of fear and regret. What if he was too late? What if she had gotten too far? He saw her after an hour of frantic riding, a small, solitary figure walking steadfastly toward the horizon, silhouetted against the dying sun. She did not seem to be fleeing, but rather marching toward a bleak and lonely fate she had chosen for herself. He reined Abel to a skidding halt a few yards from her. She stopped, her back to him, her shoulders slumped. She did not turn around.
"Go back, Elias,"
she said, her voice thick with unshed tears.
"Please, don't make this harder than it already is."
He swung himself out of the saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He walked toward her, his heart in his throat. "Harder?" he said, his voice raw. "Miriam, there is nothing left if you are not there. There is no ranch. There is no life. Just an empty house and a silence that I cannot bear."
"You will be free,"
she whispered, still not turning.
"They will forget. You can have your life back."
"You are my life," he said, his voice breaking. He was standing directly behind her now, his shadow merging with hers in the twilight. "I don't care about the town. I don't care about their whispers or their judgment. Let them talk. Their words are just wind. But you are the air I breathe." She finally turned, her face a pale, tear-streaked oval in the fading light.
"I cannot be your ruin, Elias."
He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking away her tears. He looked into her eyes, and in their depths, he finally, fully, let go of the last of his fear, the last of his grief for the past. He saw only her, and the future he would be damned to lose. "The only thing that would ruin me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, certain whisper, "is losing you." He took a deep breath and spoke the word that he had been too afraid to even think, the word that held all the promises he had never thought he would make again. "Come home, wife." The word hung in the air between them, simple, powerful, and absolute. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a claiming, a vow. Her breath hitched, and a fresh wave of tears of disbelief and overwhelming joy, spilled from her eyes. She fell into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and he held her, crushing her to him as if he could physically fuse them together and never let her go. They stood there in the vast, empty plain, two solitary figures locked in an embrace as the last sliver of the sun bled below the horizon.
leaving them in the gentle, forgiving dark. Their wedding was 2 days later. There was no preacher, no guests, no finery. They stood on the porch of the small house as the sun rose, the air cool and clean. He had fashioned a ring for her from a piece of braided leather, and he slipped it onto her finger. She had, in turn, braided a thin circlet of early spring wildflowers. They spoke their vows not to a god in the heavens, but to each other, their words soft, simple, and carried away by the morning breeze. They were promises not of forever, but of every day, one after another, together. And on the front door, where a horseshoe might hang for luck, Elias had hung a new symbol. He had taken the same wildflowers she had used for her circlet, Indian paintbrush, blue bonnets, and desert primrose, and had woven them into a wreath. It hung in the very spot where a rope might be used to tie a horse, a vibrant circle of life and color against the weathered wood. The rope that once represented bondage, burned to ash in the mud and rain, had been reborn. It was no longer a noose, but a wreath, not a restraint, but an invitation. It was a testament to a love that was not a chain, but a choice made freely, every single day. A love that was, finally, untied. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight around the Wild West campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know. If you enjoyed this tale, consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel for more stories from the Old West. We'd be honored to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them. Until next time, keep the fire bright.